Hello, welcome to the next episode of Faith and Freedom. I'm Gerrit, and on this show, I try and square a libertarian political philosophy with a Christian theology. They are two separate things, but our politics do inform our decision, but our religion should inform it more. I think these two can go together in terms of libertarianism and Christians. There are a lot of Christian libertarians out there, and there's some folks that might not identify as libertarians, as Christian libertarians, but they have some libertarian-leaning public policies. So today I want to talk about a tough subject for libertarians, and that's labor and unions. Libertarians aren't necessarily opposed to unionized labor or the right of workers to unionize, but we do believe in a free market, and a big part of a free market is the freedom of contract and private property. So private property is pretty well outlined in the Bible. It's implied through the commandments, thou shalt not steal and thou shalt not covet. In order to steal and in order to covet, there has to be an implied sense of private property. We'll come back to this in a later episode, but I want to focus more on the freedom of contract, and that is the ability for one or more people to just enter into agreement for goods or services. And this could be as simple as, I'd like to sell you this pencil for a nickel. That's a contract. I give you the pencil, you give me a nickel. It also applies to working agreements. So I am going to go work on someone's farm for a certain amount per hour or per day. The person who owns the farm gives me that contract, and I can either agree to it or not agree to it and go look for employment somewhere else. And likewise, each party has the right to end that contract. And that depends on whether or not there's a stipulation of how long the contract is. Some, in terms of employment contracts, are what are called at-will employment. So either party has the right to terminate the contract, and usually there is a notification period in there. Like most jobs, usually you're required to give a 2-week notice before you quit. Likewise, if your employer needs to lay you off for financial reasons, they have to give you a certain amount of notice. When it comes to disciplinary reasons, there might be a different policy, but it's all an agreement between two parties. So when unions come into play, you will have more than one worker joining together, thus the term union, and they negotiate with employers for wages and benefits as a group. Now, this isn't inherently anti-libertarian or anti-free market, but the problem comes in that chunk of people in the union can also represent a pretty significant voting bloc. And given the fact that much of our industry is unfortunately regulated, stimulated, subsidized by government, when you have a big voting arm like a union, that can get in there and sway that balance of power in freedom of contract. Now, there is something to the argument that modern unions are a response to what's called crony capitalism. For lack of a better definition, it's basically lobbyist money. Again, this gets back to the size and the scope of government and the relationship between government and industry. So you have CEOs and executives that get corporate tax breaks, government subsidies, things like that put more power on their side. So the workers need to respond by unionization to fight that potential for exploitation of workers. I don't know if I necessarily buy that, but I can understand that argument. And I think the solution to that is getting government out of the private sector and out of industry and business as much as possible. But that's kind of a side topic for another day. What I really want to focus in on here is the freedom of contract, and I think there's a great example of freedom of contract in Scripture in the parable of the workers. Now, this parable is in regards to the kingdom of heaven and people's salvation into that kingdom of heaven, and I think it illustrates the freedom of contract, even though it doesn't necessarily deal with the actual labor market. It uses the labor market within the parable. So if we go to Matthew chapter 20, verses 13 through 15, sort of wrap up the parable in which the worker or the owner of the vineyard has hired different workers throughout the day, and he's offered to pay them all a single denarius for a day's work, or at the end of the day. Now, when it comes time to pay, the worker that had worked all day puts up a fuss to the fact that the owner of the vineyard is paying him the same amount as a worker that was hired later in the day and only worked for a couple hours. And the response of the owner of the vineyard is as follows. But he answered one of them, I am not being unfair to you, friend. Don't you agree to work for a denarius, or didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the one who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I am generous? So that right there is a good illustration of freedom of contract. It might not be in the business world, in the labor market, the fairest contract, but each of those workers agreed to that contract. Now we could take this parable a little further and say that probably the second day, that worker who worked a whole long day for one denarius might not go back to work at that same vineyard, but that would be another example of freedom of contract. That worker has the right. He didn't like the contract. He got the bad end of the deal, so he goes somewhere else. So that's pretty much at-will employment and freedom of contract illustrated in that parable. Now, where I do think most libertarians have a problem with unions is when they come into the public sector. So we're talking about teachers unions, police unions, social worker, basically anybody who works for the government. And the reason for that is they'll tend to monopolize the labor in that sector of employment. And like we said before, the unions end up making a good sized voting chunk, which can influence the political people that are in fact doing the hiring and the administration of that employment service, and the people who are paying for these services are the taxpayers. So having public unions negotiate higher and higher wages, higher and higher benefits, more and more protections versus for getting replaced for disciplinary actions or just lack of productivity are just stacked up against a taxpayer who, honestly, we want those services to be offered for the best, lowest price possible, thus keeping our tax rates down, more money for us to spend on the things that we need and want in life in the private sector. So public sector unions didn't even exist until, I believe, the early 1960s. And one of the most progressive presidents in our country, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, when he signed the Wagner Act, which actually expanded union power for private sector unions, spoke against public sector unions. It wasn't until I believe it was Carter's administration that public sector unions were legitimized and legalized in the United States. So I would think that if even FDR, the most progressive Democratic president that we've ever had, cautioned against public sector unions, we would be wise to take heed to that. And I believe that the existence of public sector unions for the last 60, 70 years has shown that it's not a good thing. We have higher and higher costs of running the services in our government. The people that retire from those government jobs get a government pension. It's supposed to be paid for by the people that are still working in that, but it ends up being short, so they have to go after more tax money just to pay out the pensions of these workers. And we're seeing it now in the teachers unions in some of these larger cities across the country, just north of us in Buffalo. They've been all remote for a long time, and now the district parents and students and even some of the school administrators want the teachers to come back to work, teach the kids in person, I think the science is there to say that schools are not a high risk for transmission of this disease, and the parents are paying for their students' education in the form of their school tax money, and they have seen that this remote education is not working for a lot of kids, and they want to get the teachers back in the classroom teaching in person. Well, the ones putting up the most resistance to getting these teachers back in the schools in front of the kids in persons are the teachers union. And they're using the excuse that it's not safe, the teachers don't have the resources to keep them safe, when we've seen from other places in the country that have opened, other areas that have opened in person, we're just not seeing the spread. So despite what I believe the science says in terms of schools not being a high risk, you have these teachers unions that are dragging their feet on getting back in front of the kids in the classroom and giving the high quality education that we pay for in our tax money. Another example is up in our own Chautauqua County. We have a system of non-union salaried managers with unionized hourly employees underneath them. And you have a situation where the employees under the non-union managers are making more money in a lot of cases than their managers. So not only are we paying tax money to these unionized employees more and more each year because the legislator bows to the union contracts, it creates a situation where the managers have to keep up with the Joneses. So their unionized employees keep making more and more money, so they lobby for better and better, higher wages, more compensation, and of course the legislator often gives in to them. All of this leads to higher property taxes, higher sales tax, higher cost of government for the residents in the county. So while I'm on the fence in terms of my feelings of private sector unions, I'm very much against public sector unions. I think we need to be looking for candidates that'll roll that back, the unions out of the public sector, and try and balance out the unions in the private sector a little bit better, so we're back to that freedom of contract thing. And I know that's going to take not only reworking the union laws, but also getting some of the crony capitalism, the lobby money, and the corporate tax breaks and subsidies out of the way. But I think we need to move in that direction. So as always, that's my take on this, and that's sort of the libertarian angle. I'd like to invite anybody else out there who says, oh, you don't know what you're talking about, I got something to add. I'd love to come in and talk to you about how I think unions are biblical and that we should keep them in the private sector and the public sector. I'd love to have somebody come on and chat it up. This is my first time kind of doing a solo show. I'm not going to lie, I miss Mel a little bit, but that's sort of my call. If anybody else wants to come on and sort of drash out any sort of libertarian topics, feel free. You can send me a private message or get a hold of anybody at Drash Ministries. Well, thanks for joining me for another episode. Hope to see you again on Faith and Freedom.